Hi, everybody. It's Peter Selby from Business Drivers, another podcast as part of our Releasing the Business Handbrake series, where we're sharing topics, best practice, and interviewing interesting folk. And today we are really pleased to welcome Brendan O'Keefe aboard. So Brendan has a very interesting background and is a deep specialist in the supply chain world. And so we're going to interview Brendan today just to share a bit about his journey and some of the interesting things he sees in industry, etc. So welcome, Brendan.
Thank you, Peter. Great to be involved today and look forward to our discussion.
No, great. It's great to be for you to give up the time and share your wisdom with the world around us. So maybe just to kick us off, Brendan, maybe just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and some of your history and what's led you to here today.
Perfect. No, thanks, Peter. So if people haven't maybe picked up, there's a bit of an accent in there. So of Irish background, lucky enough to come to this beautiful country almost 25 years ago.
Wow.
Originally qualified as an industrial chemist, and I thought I would pursue a career in pharmaceutical industry, which I did for a few years. But then by twist of fate or opportunities, as do happen in life journey, I fell into the recruitment industry probably about 22 years ago. So that got me on a path with my technical background of starting off recruiting, in effect, the profession I'd come from. And as life evolves and opportunities evolve with that, my career has really specialized and grown and specialized across supply chain or end-to-end value operation supply chain. And that's probably been a few reasons for that, that carved that opportunity for me, Peter. The first was probably because I was doing a lot of work in the original days in manufacturing operations space. But then I noticed a significant trend of organizations offshoring or replacing their manufacturing footprint elsewhere. And a lot of my clientele at the time were actually moving from operations into logistics and supply chain management functions or related functions.
Right.
So I thought there must be something to this. So I suppose by design or by accident, I started to pursue the more supply chain value opportunities. And in effect, that probably led me to being involved with an organization originally known as Apex AU, which a few years ago became rebranded to ASCI, or its full title, Australasia Supply Chain Institute. So in effect, that's sort of been my summary journey to date, and obviously a passion for working in the supply chain space.
So what attracted you, if you go back to, your industrial chemistry, which is obviously a very specialized and highly qualified environment, what attracted you to, or circumstances led you to get into that recruitment space in the first place? I mean, it's obviously a very specialized recruitment area, but just the process of recruitment itself, what sort of took you there?
Yeah, great question. So initially I was, I thought I was going to be a forensic scientist at one point, Peter, early in my career. Right. That was the aim, because I actually did a master's in what was classified as instrumental analysis.
Right.
So very, very techie, high level, expensive equipment used to do all sorts of diagnostics in the pharmaceutical and other related industries. But I suppose the opportunity came by when I had returned to Australia as a qualified, pharmaceutical chemist, really. I'd worked originally in Australia for under 3 different contract opportunities, which was brilliant from a diversity of experience.
Sure.
And I went back to the 3 individual recruitment firms who helped me out first time round to say, look, I'm back, I'm available. what sorts of opportunities do you have? And one of them flipped the chair on me basically and said, asked the question I'd never thought of, what would you think about recruitment? So for me, I really hadn't even asked myself the question before. So my honest response was, well, I don't know what's recruitment. What do you do? So in effect, what I saw, the opportunity for me was, it was an opportunity for me to help people whose industry profiles I understood, could relate to their experience and skills, and help organizations to hire this sort of talent, and add value to both sides of that equation. And my worst case scenario, Peter, if you look at the parachute clause of getting out of that was, and this was an agreement I had with the company at the time, was that if any time in the first 6 or so months of probation, I didn't really like what I was doing from being in recruitment consultant land, then I could, be an applicant for one of the roles that might come in. So there's a bit of a safety net in there, but obviously I never thought about it again and kept going on a recruitment journey. But what I learned, I suppose, Peter, is a lot of people will probably term recruitment industry as a sales industry. It's interesting. I never really have fundamentally. I look at more the value that organizations and recruiters in those organizations can provide to companies, and the advice and support they can give to both the client and the candidates in a recruitment process. So that's sort of the value equation in which I see that recruitment as a general adds to industry.
Sort of selling without selling.
Yeah, and it's more on the basis, I think, of, where I came from. I was very facts and figures, very process driven.
Yeah.
So I wasn't, I was able to evaluate people's skills and competencies pretty well and, represent them on that basis. And likewise with companies, it's just about being transparent about, the value of what you get for what you pay in the marketplace from a benchmark perspective.
Yeah, sure, yeah. And how do you think, what does the recruitment landscape look like now compared to what it did when you first came to Australia?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. Totally different, probably, to be fair. There's still, the underlying principles and processes are similar. But if I go back 20 years ago, we all remember the Sydney Morning Herald on a Saturday, there was the business section, which was front of all the executive roles. And then there was a whole employment section, which had major pull-out section, and people would probably go looking for their job in the Sydney Morning Herald or related papers maybe back at that time. And that's where we did advertising. There was no such platform such as LinkedIn or social media applications that exist today. And it was a very different process. There was fax machines, if we remember what those are. So I tried to remember, did I even have email when I started off? Probably not. So yeah, you look at the technology landscape, it's completely different. All interviews, we're having the opportunity of using the virtual world today, which is brilliant for everyone. Back then, it was all face-to-face. There was a lot more face-to-face business, really, given what was the expectation of the time. And what I did learn, though, which is around building relationships earlier on, it's really important for the long term in the industry in general.
Do you think it's easier to find a job now than it was because of that digital platform, or not?
Look, I think in many ways, I think there's a lot more scrutiny now.
Right.
Because if you look at the different platforms that exist today, presently, we expect, or I probably typically expect as a recruiter, that people have some sort of online profile, and I'll just refer to the whole LinkedIn platform.
Sure.
Which has just grown and grown and grown extensively over the last 10 years. So I would expect that typically in my line of work, when I'm recruiting for roles, people will have a profile of some description on LinkedIn. So people can be searched out pretty quickly, for people who've got the know-how of doing those searches. There's got to be a reflection of what your LinkedIn profile says about you to what your resume does. And I think there's a lot more you've got to be, if you're an active job seeker in the current market, Peter, particularly 2020 COVID recovery environment, you've got to be a lot more active to be considered.
From a search perspective, you mean?
From a search perspective, yeah. So there's a responsiveness, I suppose, that comes with it as well, Peter.
Yeah.
So if people are, wanting to be out, are actively seeking roles for whatever reasons they have, you've got to build a relationship with with recruiters, with organizations directly. And it becomes harder to do that with probably corporate organizations because you've got a limited bandwidth to connect with relative people.
Yeah.
So it's typically through your network of valued recruiters who look after your skill sets that you need to build a relationship with, and that's investing some time with them. Obviously COVID has been a lot more virtual, but making time to connect with people in a virtual meetings,
Mm-hmm.
right through to phone calls, follow-ups, making sure that you're front of mind when the opportunities become available.
That's great advice, Ben, and obviously comes from a pile of experience and the changes you'd have seen along those ways. You mentioned before that this world had taken you to the Australian Supply Chain Institute. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that organization and what that does and how that services the market.
Yeah, absolutely. So my initial introduction was probably more by accident than design, I admit. I was working for a particular organization and there was a call in from what was APIX AU at the time. Now I'd known about APIX AU because of supply chain people I knew who had APIX certifications. So in planning, warehousing, distribution, so on. But APIX AU needed some help themselves to hire some people. So I was engaged by APIX AU, by their chief executive at the time, and we delivered what they needed and required. But ultimately then we used to connect on a regular basis. I got involved, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago, Peter. And APIX AU was starting to go through some changes whereby initially they were an education body, whereby they had very well known, not just locally, but globally for the APIX certifications, and many corporate organizations, the likes of, I'll just nominate some FMCG companies, the likes of Coca-Cola's and Unilevers and the like, would have put all of their people through APIX training certification because it was a very high standard and a common standard that people had in alignment. And I was finding that, the purpose of APIX AU, which then changed into ASCI, which I'll talk about in a moment, was really around professionalization, supply chain professionalization. So it was doing it in different ways. One was, which they still do, providing the programs, basics, APIX underpinned programs right through to what is now being progressed into chartered supply